Under the pale Alabama sun, Fair Hollow looked like a place that had been spared. The war had taken men, crops, and coins, but the white-painted parish church still stood unburned, its bell tower rising clean against the sky. People said God had protected it. Others, quieter and older, said something else had chosen it. The building had an air that felt both preserved and sealed, like a jar kept too long on a shelf. In the weeks after the surrender, funerals became common. Soldiers returned in coffins, and sickness came with the heat. The choir sang for each burial, voices soft and unshaken, yet their harmony never wavered even when a singer was missing from the pew. It was the kind of sound that made the hairs on the neck stand, not because it was beautiful, but because it was complete, unnaturally so. Those who listened too long found themselves uneasy, glancing at the choir loft, counting heads and wondering why the sound never thinned. The church smelled faintly of candle smoke and something harder to name, something metallic under the sweet beeswax. At the front, the baptismal font stood as it always had, carved stone worn smooth from decades of touch. Yet on certain mornings after a burial, a pale film coated the water, gray as ash. Mothers whispered it was dust from the rafters. Fathers told their children not to speak of it. No one went to the priest about it. They all knew he would smile, bless the water, and say that the Lord's work leaves traces the unfaithful cannot understand. Still in the pews during those long funeral hymns, the widows clutched their black veils tighter, and their eyes darted not to the coffin but to the choir. The singers themselves looked unchanged. Boys who had returned from tending to the wounded in far-off battlefields now stood in perfect posture beside girls who had never left town. Their eyes never wandered during a hymn. Their mouths opened and closed in perfect unison, every vowel formed with measured care. It was not the ordinary discipline of a trained choir. It was something heavier, as if they were bound together by an invisible rope that none dared loosen. People swore they could pick out the voice of someone long dead, woven into the harmonies, faint but certain, like a name whispered from another room. On one particularly humid afternoon, when the funeral of a young widow was held, the air in the church thickened to the point of nausea. The song began low, a lament rising slowly in strength. Somewhere in the second verse, the sound shifted, not louder, not higher, but fuller, as if an extra set of lungs had joined. Those in the front pew swore they felt a cold draft move past their ankles, though the doors were shut. A child began to cry, but was hushed by a trembling hand. In the loft, the choirmaster, Brother Ellery, moved his hands with slow, deliberate arcs, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. His face was unreadable, almost serene. By the final note, there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the song itself had not ended but was still echoing somewhere just beyond hearing. When the coffin was lowered into the earth that evening, those who attended claimed the dirt sounded different, hitting the lid duller, as though it fell onto cloth rather than wood. And later, back in the church, the font's water was no longer clear. It shimmered faintly in the lamplight, gray swirling like smoke caught in glass. No one touched it. No one asked. They simply left the church doors locked until the next funeral, when the choir would sing again, perfect and whole, no matter who was missing from the rows. And so it began. The quiet season when Fair Hollow's grief was not only for the dead they buried, but also for something unseen that had begun to settle inside the walls, patient and listening, waiting for its next note to be sung. Brother Ellery returned to Fair Hollow in the late summer of 1865, walking into town without warning, carrying nothing but a small wooden case and the faint smell of carbolic and dried blood. The war had thinned him but not broken him. His skin was as pale as candle wax, stretched smooth over high cheekbones, and his eyes, once quick and kindly, now seemed glassy, as though they saw something fixed far away. People greeted him softly, grateful to see a familiar face among so many gone, yet no one held his gaze for long. There was something in the way he moved, a careful, deliberate stillness, the same measured pace in every step, as if each movement had been thought through before it happened. In the church, he slipped back into his role without question. The choir, once scattered by the war, gathered again at his call. But Ellery no longer scheduled rehearsals for Sunday afternoons. Now they met after dark. At first, the change seemed harmless. The evening air was cooler, he said, better for the voice. The oil lamps glowed in the loft as the first hymns began, and the town's remaining singers, boys returned from battlefield hospitals and girls whose brothers would never come home, filled the rafters with sound. Yet as the weeks passed, people noticed the rehearsals ran later, long after the lamps in the main hall had burned out. From the street, faint voices could still be heard, drawn-out notes that seemed to vibrate in the bones. Sometimes there was silence, and then, without warning, a single voice would pierce the stillness, holding a pitch until it bent and broke into a rasp. Those who stayed behind after evening prayers claimed they had seen shadows moving against the loft's wall, even when no one was there. A few said the singing did not stop when the singers left, that it followed them home, thin and hollow like the sound of wind trapped in a bottle. Ellery never appeared tired, even on nights that went past midnight. He would stand at the center of the loft with his hands folded and eyes half closed, listening with an intensity that unsettled those near him. He did not speak often, but when he did, his voice was gentle, almost soothing, as if calming a frightened child. That gentleness made the unease worse, for it left no clear edge to grasp, no sign of anger, no sign of fatigue, just the unwavering patience of a man who had decided exactly what he wanted. It was said he had tended to soldiers dying in tents during the war, holding them upright so their last breath could escape cleanly, their lungs emptied for the chaplain's prayer. He never confirmed it, yet when he instructed the choir to sing until the breath itself failed, his words carried the weight of someone who understood the very moment when life left the body. He told them that perfect harmony came only when the voice met its own limit, when the body yielded and the sound passed beyond flesh. His singers began to look different after only a few weeks, lips dry and cracked from the strain, eyes unfocused after practice, shoulders slumped in the pews. Still none quit. Ellery's approval was as quiet as his disapproval, and both felt binding. By the harvest season, the town had grown used to the sight of the church loft lit long into the night, the lamplight flickering through the stained glass like a moving shadow. They did not know that sometimes, after the last singer had left, Ellery remained alone, humming to the empty loft. He would hum low as if testing a room for echoes, pausing to listen after each phrase. The notes seemed to linger longer than they should, not fading into the stillness but folding back soft and close as if answered. In those moments his face changed, the stillness deepened, and something sharp flickered behind his calm expression, like the edge of a blade hidden under cloth. The sound of the choir seemed to follow him now, even in the silence, as though he carried it inside him piece by piece, waiting for the day it would be whole again. And when that day came, he knew it would not matter whether the voices were living or dead. The vestry had always been a place of open comings and goings, a small side room where linens were pressed, candles were kept, and hymnals were stacked in careful rows. But by the autumn of 1865, its door was never seen open, not even on Sundays. The brass handle, once dulled by years of touch, now shone from frequent use. Yet it was only Brother Ellery's hand that turned it. One afternoon, a parish boy named Thomas was sent with a crate of fresh candles from the chandler's shop. He found the door locked, the wood warm under his palm as if something inside had been burning. From beyond the panels came a faint, steady humming, low and measured, the kind of tune meant for the self, not an audience. It was joined by a sharper sound, a dry scraping like metal against bone or stone, drawn out in careful strokes. He pressed his ear closer and caught a smell that was neither the sweetness of candle wax nor the dust of hymnals. It was heavier, layered, boiled linseed oil, sharp and oily, and beneath it the bite of iron, like the tang of blood. When Thomas knocked softly, the humming stopped. Silence pressed against the wood, thick and unyielding. After a long pause, Ellery's voice came, quiet but edged, instructing the boy to leave the crate by the door. Thomas did as told and left. But in the days that followed, he noticed the vestry was always the first room Ellery entered in the morning and the last he left at night. Sometimes the light beneath the door flickered, casting restless shapes across the stone floor, shapes that didn't match the stillness of a man alone. Parish workers spoke of hearing the same scraping in the late hours when they passed the church on their way home. Some claimed it was carpentry, others said sharpening, though no repairs appeared anywhere in the building. By November, the smell had seeped into the hallway, faint most days, stronger after funerals. It clung to the hems of Ellery's black coat, followed him into the loft, and seemed to settle on the choir's sheet music. On cold mornings, frost formed differently along the vestry door, a darker sheen in the center where the wood seemed to breathe warmth. No one asked what he was doing, not out of trust, but because his presence carried an unspoken rule. What was behind that door was his alone. And so the vestry became more than a locked room. It became a held breath in the heart of the church, a place where something unseen was being made ready, shaped by hands that moved with patience and purpose, waiting for the day it would be revealed. The parish had always kept careful records. Births, baptisms, marriages, and funerals were written in a neat hand on cream-colored pages, bound in sturdy covers that smelled faintly of dust and candle smoke. But as the year turned toward its bitter winter, those who handled the books began to notice a troubling pattern. The names of young choir members appeared too often in the funeral columns, their causes of death written in short, tidy words: fever, accident, consumption. There was no note of suspicion, No hint of investigation, only the calm ink of an official truth. To those who asked, it was said the war had left everyone weaker, and illness took the young as easily as the old. Yet in the choir loft, the absences never felt like they belonged to the sickbed. They felt like vanishing. Brother Ellery carried his own book, smaller than the parish register, bound in black leather that gleamed faintly when it caught the light. He never let it leave his possession. It lay on the organ bench during rehearsals, beside him during Sunday Mass, and on the vestry desk when the door was locked. Those who caught a glimpse of its open pages saw not scripture but names written in 2 columns. One for the living members of the choir, one for those gone. Beside each name were marks no one could quite interpret. A small note symbol, a looping curve like a breath mark in sheet music, and sometimes a tiny number written in the corner. When a singer died, their name was crossed from one column and written again in the other, not erased but preserved, as if the 2 lists were not opposites but stages in a single process. Ellery's care in maintaining the ledger was unsettling in its precision. Each letter was written with a fine nib, the ink dark and unblotted, as though any flaw on the page would be an offense. He would pause over certain names, resting his fingertips lightly on the paper, lips moving in a silent hum before dipping his pen again. Some said they had seen him turn a page not to write but to simply look, lingering on the ink as if it were a portrait of the person rather than their name. The book was never left unattended, not even in the locked vestry. If Ellery left the loft, it went with him under his arm. Over time, the funerals became so frequent that the parish register filled faster than in any year before. Yet no one in authority linked the pattern to the choir. The explanations were always simple and in their simplicity unchallengeable. But among the choir members an unease had taken root. They had noticed the same thing. That once Ellery wrote a mark beside a name, the singer seldom lasted more than a month. And yet, when the black ledger was brought out at rehearsals, every head bent toward it in quiet obedience, as though being in its pages was both an honor and a fate they could not refuse. The book itself seemed to carry a weight beyond its leather and paper, a kind of gravity that drew Ellery's attention away from everything else. He guarded it not like a tool but like a relic, and in his mind it was precisely that. A living archive of voices, a score written not in notes but in names. Each entry was another step toward the harmony he pursued with the same quiet persistence he had shown in every other part of his life. The dead, to him, were not gone. They were simply moved to a different section of the arrangement, still present in ways the others could not yet hear. And with each funeral, the ledger grew heavier in his hands, as though the ink itself carried the breath of the ones who had sung their last note under his watch. It began quietly without announcement, folded into the rhythm of the choir's evening rehearsals as if it had always been there. Ellery called it the sustaining of the final note, a test of the singer's devotion and control. At first it seemed harmless, a way to strengthen the lungs and to sharpen discipline. But the way he conducted it made it clear that this was no exercise in music. He would lead the choir through the hymn as usual, his hands calm, his eyes half closed. Then on the last verse his gestures would slow and narrow until every singer's gaze was locked on him. The final chord would come, and instead of releasing it, he would hold his hands steady in the air, palm down, demanding that every mouth remain open, every chest fully extended, and the air driven out in one long, unbroken sound. It was not simply about pitch. It was about endurance, about draining the body until it trembled. At first, the singers gave what they could, their voices falling away when breath failed them. But Ellery did not stop for those who dropped out. He would stare at them in silence as the others carried on, the faintest hint of disappointment in his still face, until they flushed with shame. Soon they began pushing past their limits, straining for seconds longer, willing themselves to keep going even when their vision blurred and their legs wavered. The sound that filled the loft grew stranger with each attempt, pure at first, then breaking, cracking, and splintering into gasps. When one singer collapsed to their knees mid-note, Ellery stepped forward, steadying them with a hand on the shoulder, and whispered something no one else could hear before returning to his place. The next night the same singer returned, and though their cheeks were pale and their lips faintly stained with red, they tried harder than before. Ellery began timing these endings, not with a watch but by the feel of the sound itself. He seemed to sense the moment when a voice crossed into its final reserve, when the note was no longer supported by will alone but by something deeper, almost primal. In those seconds his expression shifted, a faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, a slow breath drawn through his nose, as if he were savoring a flavor on the air. Some singers began to cough once the note was cut, small flecks of blood appearing on their hands or the hems of their sleeves. Others staggered, dizzy and disoriented, staring at the floor as though the world had tipped beneath them. Ellery called these signs proof of commitment. He told them that in those last moments before collapse, their voices were closest to God's ear, that the thin thread of sound they gave at the edge of consciousness was the truest offering a mortal could make. The practice became the core of his rehearsals. The hymns themselves were almost an afterthought, stepping stones to the long, punishing final note. No one refused. There was a strange pride in lasting longer than before, in holding on until the body gave out. Those who faltered too soon felt the weight of Ellery's gaze upon them and knew they would not be chosen for the special services, the ones whispered about among the choir, where the music was said to be unlike anything sung for the congregation. Outside the loft, the town noticed the singers growing pale, their voices hoarser and their posture more rigid. But the music on Sundays was flawless, so no one asked why the choir's perfection came at such a visible cost. For Ellery, the ritual was more than a test. It was a shaping, a slow carving away of hesitation and self-preservation, leaving only the voice and the will to obey. He did not think of it as cruelty, but as refinement. Each collapse a step closer to the sound he heard in his mind. A sound without weakness, without breath, eternal. And as winter crept into Fair Hollow, the choir's final notes grew longer and more haunting, hanging in the air like something that refused to die, even after the singers had fallen silent. The vestry had always been a room of preparation, but by winter its purpose had shifted into something no one could name aloud. Behind its locked door, Brother Ellery worked with a patience that seemed almost holy to those who did not understand its true end. The room was warmer than the rest of the church, the air heavy with a strange sweetness that masked something harsher beneath. In the corner on a narrow table worn smooth with use sat the object he had spent months perfecting. A crude dome of thick, uneven glass fixed onto a wooden base. It was large enough to cover the head and shoulders of a person, the edges sealed with a band of stiffened cloth soaked in some hardening resin. The surface was clouded in places, scarred by heat and the imperfect firing of the glass, but it was solid and airtight once lowered. At its crown, a small glass pipe protruded, fitted with a stopper and a length of thin tubing that coiled like a vein into a waiting jar. Ellery called it a bell, though it was nothing meant to ring. Its purpose was simple in his mind: to hold the final breath of a singer, to take it before it was wasted on the open air. He believed that the last exhalation, the one that left after the body had no more voice to give, carried something beyond mere air. It was the purest tone, stripped of all living imperfection, a note that could never be sung again. In the privacy of the vestry, he had learned how to capture it. A singer would be led in, already weakened from rehearsal, their chest rising and falling too fast. He would place the dome over their head with steady care, the resin seal pressing against their shoulders. The glass would fog almost instantly from the heat of their breath. Through the pipe, he would guide the air into the jar, his hand on the stopper, ready to trap it at the exact moment their body surrendered. He worked without cruelty in his expression, only an unwavering focus, as though conducting an invisible orchestra in the stillness. The moment of suffocation was brief but absolute, and when it came, he sealed the jar in one practiced motion, marking the lid in his small, perfect handwriting. The singer's name, the date, and the hymn number of their last song. The bodies were returned to their beds or to waiting carriages under the same explanations that had served him all season: illness, fainting spells, and sudden fever. The jars, meanwhile, were arranged in careful rows inside a locked cabinet, each one holding what he believed to be a fragment of the eternal harmony he sought. The jars varied in weight only slightly, yet to Ellery each felt distinct in the hand, as if the breath inside had substance. Some were cool to the touch, others seemed faintly warm, even days after sealing. At night, when the church was empty, he would sit before them, opening one at a time, just enough to let the faintest whisper escape. He claimed he could hear the tone in it, so soft it felt more than heard, like the vibration of a string in a dark room. To him, these were not trophies but sacred tools, building blocks for a work no one else could yet understand. The vestry began to smell of the jars themselves, a mingling of the oil from the seals and the faint, sweet decay of trapped breath. The air was never entirely still. It seemed to move against the skin as if stirred by something unseen. Those who entered briefly, the rare few sent in for supplies under Ellery's supervision, left with the uneasy sense that the room had been watching them. They could not name what about it felt alive, but Ellery knew. To him, the jars were not silent. They were waiting. And as he worked, refining his process, he imagined the day he would open them all at once and let the collected voices rise together, breathing again, filling the church with a sound no living congregation could match. It was not murder in his mind. It was preservation, the saving of something that would otherwise vanish into the air, lost forever. In this he believed he was closer to God than any priest. The organ had always been the heart of the church, its deep swelling voice guiding the congregation through hymns like a tide, carrying them toward the shore of God. But under Ellery's hands, it became something else, a silent instrument even when it was not being played, a presence that breathed with malice. He began his work on it in the quiet hours between dusk and true night, when the last footsteps had faded from the nave and the air had cooled enough for the stone walls to contract with faint groaning sounds. With a small jar hidden beneath his robes, he moved along the quays, brushing a thin coat of the substance he had prepared in the vestry onto specific notes. It was a caustic mixture, sharp enough to burn skin, yet subtle enough that no one would notice until they had pressed down long enough to feel the sting. He chose the keys with care, never all at once, never in a pattern that could be guessed. A low D here, a trembling E above, and a high G so sweet it begged to be played again and again. He told himself this was not cruelty but correction. To sing in service of the divine required more than a voice. It required a body willing to bleed for beauty. The fingertips, he believed, were the most honest part of a singer's body, the point where their intention touched the world. Pain was a purifying force, a reminder that worship was not meant to be easy. When the singers sat at the bench, their hands spread across the ivory, the first contact was harmless. It was only after a few repetitions, as they lingered on certain notes, that the skin began to redden, then blister. Ellery watched from the shadows of the pews, his gaze fixed not on the music but on their faces. The small flinch, the tightening jaw, the moment they realized something was wrong yet continued to play because the hymn demanded it. Within days, the signs began to show. Fingertips wrapped in cloth, hands trembling as they turned pages of sheet music, crimson smears on the white edges of hymnals. Some tried to disguise the pain, believing it a private weakness. Others came to him in confession, whispering about their injuries, seeking permission to rest. He would smile in a way that seemed gentle and tell them that pain was simply the body's way of agreeing with the soul's struggle. He compared it to the crown of thorns, to the nails, to every wound that had ever been suffered in the name of faith. And they listened, because his voice carried the certainty of someone who had seen the truth and could not be shaken from it. The organ itself began to change. The caustic left faint discolorations on the keys, thin lines and blotches that deepened with time, as if the instrument were absorbing the suffering of those who touched it. In the right light, the marks looked almost like veins beneath skin. Ellery believed the organ's voice had deepened and grown richer, as though it was drinking from the pain he fed it. Sometimes late at night he would sit alone at the bench and press the altered keys, holding the notes until his own skin burned. He welcomed the pain, letting it anchor him, imagining it flowing into the sound that rose and swelled until it filled the empty church. He saw no sin in this, only devotion made visible, an offering no less pure than the breath in his jars or the collapse of a voice pushed beyond mortal limits. By the end of the month, no one could play the organ without injury, yet no one dared suggest it should be cleaned or repaired. Ellery had made certain of that. The pain had become part of the ritual, part of the music, and part of the proof that they were giving everything they could. And in the quiet after the final hymn, when the air still trembled with the fading notes, he felt the same quiet satisfaction he always did. the knowledge that he had brought them closer, not to comfort, but to the sharp, bright edge of something far greater. The church was silent in the hours after midnight, the kind of silence that feels aware, as if it is listening for something to disturb it. Ellery moved through that silence like a shadow with purpose, the soles of his shoes barely whispering against the flagstone floor. In his hands he carried a small iron key, cold and worn smooth by years of turning the same stubborn lock. It opened the narrow cupboard behind the vestry, a space no one else dared to touch. Inside, lined neatly on the top shelf, were jars of cloudy brine. Each jar held a small, pale shape, some smooth and round like river stones, others slightly twisted, the tissue mottled with veins. They were not stones, and the water was not clean. Each was the larynx of a singer who had once lifted their voice in the choir, now sealed, labeled, and stored like relics of a private religion. The labels were not names. Ellery had long since abandoned the idea that names mattered once the body had stopped. Instead, he wrote the hymn number most often sung by that voice, as though the flesh itself still belonged to the music. He believed the larynx was the truest part of the human body, more intimate than the heart, more sacred than the brain. It was the place where breath became sound, where spirit turned to something others could hear. Death did not, in his mind, undo this sanctity. If anything, it made the voice more pure, stripped of will, stripped of pride. The dead did not resist him, did not falter in pitch or grow hoarse. They simply waited, silent and preserved, until he called them to sing again. The bellows was his own invention, a squat wooden frame with 2 leather lungs and a series of fine tubes ending in slender nozzles. He had shaped each nozzle to fit snugly against the brined throat, sealing it with wax to prevent any escape of air. When he pressed the bellows, the air hissed through the old vocal cords, making them tremble. The sound was not singing as the living knew it. It was breath turned strange, a whispering moan that seemed to rise from the edge of memory. In the darkness, Ellery would arrange the jars along the benches of the empty choir loft, each one fixed upright so that the neck faced forward. He worked in complete silence until they were ready, then stepped to the bellows, drawing in the air as though he himself were about to sing. The first push was always the most delicate. The sounds emerged like something waking from a long sleep. Faint, airy notes that quivered and swelled, colliding with each other in the stillness. He adjusted the rhythm, pressing harder on certain larynxes, letting others fade until the loft was filled with a fragile, ghostly harmony. To him it was not macabre, it was a restoration. These voices had given themselves to God in life. He was only ensuring they could continue in death. On Sunday mornings, when the congregation gathered below, no one heard the ghost choir in the way he did. The living choir sang with bright, clear voices, their mouths wide, their eyes lifted toward the rafters. But Ellery knew the dead were there, threading their breathless tones through the music like fine smoke curling through sunlight. The congregation felt it without knowing. A strange heaviness in their chests, a shiver along their spines during certain verses, and the inexplicable sting of tears in moments where the melody alone could not account for it. They believed it was the spirit moving among them. Ellery smiled to himself in those moments because in a way they were right. The brined larynxes aged differently. Some deepened in tone, producing low, mournful notes that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. Others sharpened into thin, reedy cries like wind scraping through broken shutters. He adjusted the bellows to match the hymns, blending the dead voices into the living ones with a precision that was almost tender. No one suspected. Even the choir members seated so close to the jars during practice noticed only a faint scent of salt and something faintly metallic in the air. They thought it was the old wood of the loft or the rusting pipes of the organ. Ellery's satisfaction did not come from their ignorance, but from the seamlessness of it all. The line between life and death was not a boundary for him, only a veil that could be lifted with care and skill. He believed the dead deserved to keep serving their purpose, and he alone had the devotion to make it so. In the dim hours before dawn, when the last note had faded and the jars had been returned to their hidden shelf, he would stand in the center of the loft, hands resting on the bellows, and breathe in the heavy, salt-tinged air. To others, it would have been the air of a tomb. To him, it was alive. The bell tower rose above the village like a stone finger pointing toward heaven. But to Ellery it was less a symbol of faith and more a place of passage. The narrow seam where earth and sky met, where flawed voices could be remade into something pure. He never spoke of this belief openly, for the congregation would not understand, but he carried it in him like scripture. The failures were always chosen carefully, never at random. A singer whose pitch wandered, whose breath betrayed the hymn's intent, whose devotion seemed to wither beneath the weight of repetition. These were the ones summoned after dusk. Ellery's voice in those moments was calm, almost paternal, telling them the tower offered a better vantage to hear God's call. None questioned him. His authority, wrapped in the solemn dignity of his office, was enough to guide them upward. The climb was slow, the spiral steps of stone tightening as they rose. The air grew colder and thinner, each breath drawing in the faint taste of iron and old dust. The wood of the final landing creaked under their weight, and the vast dark space above unfolded like an unlit cathedral. In its center, the great bell hung heavy in its cradle, its iron lip blackened from centuries of tolling. Beneath it, a beam crossed the width of the chamber, worn smooth where the rope of the bell had rubbed it for generations. Ellery had made certain the rope's length was just enough to conceal its other purpose. The bell's pull was a distraction, a camouflage. He worked methodically as though preparing for a holy rite. The rope looped and tightened in his hands with the skill of long practice, the knot neither cruel nor clumsy but deliberate, like a craftsman binding the final piece of a sacred object. He would speak softly as he worked, telling the singer their note was not wrong but incomplete, that God's ear was not yet satisfied. There was no anger in his tone, no threat, only a strange certainty that this was the only path forward. The moment they stood upon the small, worn plank beneath the beam, Ellery's focus sharpened to a perfect point. The drop itself was never loud. It was the bell that roared, its deep toll rolling through the night air, swallowing the sharp snap of the rope's weight. The village below heard nothing unusual, only the familiar sound of their church calling the hour. And they turned in their beds or murmured a prayer without knowing they were answering a death. In the tower, the silence after the toll was absolute. Ellery would stand in that stillness, watching the last shudder in the rope, feeling the echo of the bell still vibrating in his bones. He thought of it as an ascension, the voice, imperfect in life, now carried upward on a note no ear could measure. He never rushed to cut them down. The waiting was part of the offering, a period in which the soul, freed from its flawed instrument, could drift toward the source of all music. Only when the air felt clear again, when the weight of the moment had dissolved into something lighter, would he untie the rope and lower the body. By then the eyes were empty, the mouth slack, and the voice gone. Yet Ellery always looked upon them with the satisfaction of a conductor who had finally resolved a discord. In the morning the absence was explained away with ease. Singers who left the choir often did so quietly, slipping into work in the fields or service in another parish. No one in the village had reason to suspect that the bell tower kept its own ledger of voices lost, but Ellery knew. He heard it in the choir's tone each Sunday, a slight tightening of harmony, a sharper, cleaner resonance, as if the missing had left behind a fragment of themselves that the living absorbed. The congregation, as always, mistook the change for a divine blessing. Ellery let them believe it. The truth, like the bell's echo, belonged only to him. The ledger was not hidden in the way guilty men hide things. It sat on the far corner of Ellery's desk, plain leather worn to a dull sheen, its spine soft from years of use. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like the ordinary records of choir attendance or hymn schedules. When the parish priest fell ill and the caretaker was asked to keep the music in order, it seemed natural enough to open it. He had expected neat columns of names, perhaps the occasional note about a singer's range or punctuality. Instead, the first thing he noticed was the symbols. Not words, not numbers, but small, deliberate marks beside each name. Some were tiny quarter notes drawn with precision, their stems straight and unwavering. Others were more cryptic, a circle enclosing a number or the careful outline of a knot tied at its center. The marks were not random. They formed a quiet, private language only the writer could fully read. The caretaker turned the pages slowly, his finger pausing over each symbol. The quarter notes, repeated most often, neat and harmless at first glance. Then came the circles with numbers which he began to suspect were not choir positions but something kept elsewhere, perhaps in storage. The knots unsettled him most, sketched so simply yet carrying a strange gravity, as if they marked a conclusion rather than a detail. He began to notice patterns. Certain names appeared again years later paired with a knot or a number where once there had been a note. Others carried dates written in the same steady hand, but those dates had not yet arrived. The ink was fresh, the paper crisp. These future entries felt heavier than the rest, as though they were not notes of intention but appointments already set in stone. The caretaker did not know Ellery well beyond his public manner. The measured steps, the calm voice, and the way he would lower his head in thought before offering any answer. He had always seemed devoted to the music, a quiet fixture in the parish, incapable of cruelty. But as the caretaker's eyes moved through the ledger, he began to feel watched, even in the empty room. Each mark on the page carried the weight of a decision made far from any committee or confession. It was not a record of work. It was a catalogue of fate. The symbols were the proof of some process carried out in silence, a private judgment beyond the reach of the church's rights. He flipped back to the earliest entries, noticing how the handwriting had not changed. 10 years of names, each handled with the same steady care, as if the act of writing them was part of something larger. In some places, the ink had spread slightly into the fibers, blurred by time or perhaps by a hand resting too long on the page. He imagined Ellery bent over the desk late at night, not rushing, not hesitating, but filling the ledger the way another man might water plants. A small, necessary tending to something that must continue to live. The caretaker could not shake the sense that the symbols were not meant to be read by others, that they were both a record and a ritual, a way for Ellery to speak to himself in a code no one else would hear. The later pages drew him in despite himself. Names he recognized from the current choir appeared in the columns, some with the familiar quarter notes, others with the rope knot, and several with dates only weeks or months away. These were not birth dates nor anniversaries, they were something else entirely. The caretaker felt his chest tighten as he counted how many bore the mark of the knot. He pictured each singer's face as they stood in the choir loft, the way their voices blended, and the trust in their eyes when they followed Ellery's lead. And yet here they were, already set down in ink, each symbol like a quiet verdict that no one had told them about. The ledger was closed carefully, though the caretaker's hands trembled as he set it back on the desk. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air colder. Somewhere in the village, Ellery was going about his day, perhaps choosing hymns or speaking kindly to a parishioner in the street. The thought of him moving through the world with this private book of futures hidden in plain sight made the caretaker's stomach turn. He knew he should tell someone, the priest, the bishop, anyone, but the certainty in Ellery's handwriting made him hesitate. These were not plans. They were promises, and promises once written had a way of keeping themselves. The wind came first, low and restless, pressing against the stained glass like a hand searching for a way in. Rain followed, tapping against the roof in sharp, hurried strokes, a sound that would have been comforting if not for the way the church doors had been bolted from the inside. Ellery stood at the center of the nave, his arms folded loosely behind his back, the long shadows from the candles bending over him as if they too were leaning in to listen. The choir, what remained of it, stood in a rigid semicircle before him. Their voices had been summoned for a hymn they did not yet know, but the unease in their faces was clear. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic, a scent that grew stronger each time the wind forced a draft through the stone gaps. Ellery's eyes moved over them with quiet precision, noting who stood tall, who avoided his gaze, and who still believed this was only a rehearsal. He had chosen this night carefully, a storm to drown the sound outside, to swallow the truth before it could reach the village. The exits were already sealed, not only the doors but also the narrow vestry passage and the side gate that led to the courtyard. He had locked them himself, feeling each latch click into place like the teeth of a mechanism finally complete. For weeks he had been writing the arrangement not on paper but in his mind, each note assigned, each voice mapped into a tapestry that would never fray. This was not performance. It was complete. When he lifted his hands, they followed without question, the instinct of discipline overcoming their doubt. The first note was low, a hum that rose from their chests and filled the wooden vaults. Ellery listened for the blend, for the absence of air between the tones, the way a surgeon listens for the steady rhythm of a heartbeat before cutting deeper. As they sang, he felt the walls respond, the very structure of the church holding the sound as if it had been waiting centuries for this. But perfection was not yet there. He stepped closer to the line of singers, his presence like a weight pressing them to hold their pitch. Somewhere beneath the harmony, he imagined he could hear the other voices, those already gone, those whose absence had been folded into silence. They were not memories to him, but active threads woven into this night by will alone. The storm outside swelled, thunder breaking against the sky in distant pulses as if nature itself were keeping time. Ellery's hands became sharper in their motion, slicing through the air with exact demands, forcing the singers higher, fuller, until their throats strained and their eyes glistened. He knew they would falter soon. The living always did. But he needed them to reach that single, unsustainable peak where the body no longer owned the voice. That was where the dead could enter, where breath and absence could fuse into a single sound. One by one, he began to close the space around them, moving his own body so they had less room to shift and less air to pull into their lungs. The candles flickered wildly as the draft found its way under the bolted doors, carrying with it the groan of old wood under strain. The notes grew uneven, some slipping sharp, others flattening, but Ellery's eyes shone with a fevered calm. He could hear it now, the blend that could not exist in life alone. The dead did not tire. They did not break. They filled the gaps where the living failed, wrapping the sound in something weightless yet unyielding. When one of the sopranos stumbled back, clutching her chest, Ellery did not stop. His hand only urged the others to be louder and stronger, as if her silence had been prearranged. The thunder answered them, rattling the beams overhead, the rain hammering against the windows like fists. The storm was a mask, a curtain, a witness that could never speak. And in the midst of it, the hymn reached its final ascent, a note stretched thin as glass, trembling but unbroken, held in the grip of voices from both sides of the grave. Ellery's expression softened then, the faintest trace of satisfaction in the set of his mouth, the completion of something long promised in ink and symbol. When the last vibration faded into the rafters, the church felt impossibly still. The storm continued its siege outside, but within these walls nothing moved. The choir stood frozen. Some bent forward in exhaustion, others staring at nothing, their lips parted as if the song still clung to them. Ellery lowered his hands slowly, letting the silence settle like ash after a fire. For a long moment he did not move, his gaze fixed on the darkened vault above as though listening for an echo that only he could hear. Then, with deliberate care, he turned toward the vestry door, still locked, still sealed, and walked into the shadow without a sound. By morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of damp slate. Smoke still clung to the eaves of the church, curling upward in thin, reluctant threads. The fire had not gutted the building entirely. The stone walls stood darkened and damp, the roof blackened but intact. Yet the air inside told another story. It was heavy with the sour tang of burned wood and something more intimate, the scent of charred flesh lingering like a confession no one wanted to hear. The pews closest to the altar were little more than skeletal frames, the varnish blistered and peeling. Candle stubs had melted into pools on the floor, their shapes warped beyond recognition, as though they too had been part of the offering. In the center, the baptismal font waited, untouched by flame, yet marked by something far more deliberate. It was half filled with gray ash, so fine it shifted with the smallest movement of air, swirling in lazy circles as if stirred by an unseen hand. Here and there, flecks of pale white bone shone against the dull gray, not large enough to identify but too brittle and too human to mistake for anything else. Those who entered later would whisper of it as Ellery's final work, the culmination of a hymn that was never meant for the living alone. The font, once a cradle for new life, had become a chalice for endings, its water long drained, replaced with what remained when breath and voice were burned away. The jars were gone, every numbered glass vessel that had lined the vestry shelves, each holding its mute fragment of some forgotten ritual, had vanished without trace. No broken shards, no soot-stained lids, nothing but the faint outlines of dust where they had once rested. Some claimed Ellery had taken them before the fire and hidden them deep where no search could reach. Others believed they had shattered in the heat, their contents released to mingle with the smoke, carried out into the sleeping village and beyond. But there were those who swore, in low voices and only after dark, that they could still hear them. Faint rattles, the soft clink of glass against glass, somewhere behind the stone walls. The choir was gone. Every name once inked in the ledger now belonged to silence, their voices erased from the world, yet somehow embedded in the stillness of the church. When the wind moved through the cracks in the high windows, it sometimes caught in the charred beams and made a low, hollow tone like breath forced through a broken instrument. It was never the same pitch twice, never lasting more than a few heartbeats, but it was enough to raise the hair on the neck of anyone who lingered to listen. Those who knew the hymns said the tones were pieces of them, warped but recognizable, as if the voices had not been destroyed at all, only transformed. No one saw Ellery again. His absence was not sudden but complete, like the vanishing of a shadow when the light changes. Some said the fire had taken him, that his body was among the ashes in the font. Others insisted they had seen him days later, walking the narrow road beyond the marsh, carrying nothing but a small black case in his left hand. There was no proof either way. Only the unsettling truth that he had been capable of both fates. His work had always been patient, methodical, and unwilling to yield to time or mercy. It was not in his nature to leave anything unfinished, and yet standing in the ruined church it was impossible to say whether this was an ending or a beginning. By the end of that week the parish bell was removed, its cracked bronze sent away to be melted down, as if silencing. The building would silence its history. But still at certain hours the sound returned. Not the deep toll of the bell, but the layering of voices, high, low, wavering, threading through one another like smoke in reverse, pulling inward instead of drifting away. Some said it was only the wind, or the memory of the storm, or the trick of a mind that had heard too much. Others refused to go near the place at all. And somewhere in the shifting gray of the ashes in the font, the flecks of white bone remained untouched, as though waiting for the one hand that knew how to stir them back into song. Years passed, and Fair Hollow learned to wear its silence like a second skin. Time had weathered the ruins of the church, softening its blackened stone with moss and rain, yet the shape of its charred frame remained visible from the main road like a wound that refused to close. The fire was never spoken of openly. Those who had been children then were grown now, raising their own families, and they taught their young to keep their distance. Outsiders sometimes asked why the church had never been rebuilt, why no service had taken its place, but their questions were met with polite diversion. The name Ellery had faded from public record, erased from parish logs and council minutes, but in the private corners of memory it remained sharp, waiting, like glass beneath dust. In this way the town did not forget him. It merely learned to bury the thought before it reached the tongue. One morning, without warning or announcement, a plaque appeared on the low stone wall that marked the church's edge. It was a small rectangle of weathered bronze, its corners greened with the first traces of corrosion, bolted so cleanly into the stone that it seemed it had always been there. No one admitted to placing it. No workman had been seen, no tools left behind, and no sign of disturbance in the earth. The words were plain, the lettering shallow but precise, for those whose voices are not gone, only hidden. There was no date, no scripture, and no mention of the fire. The townsfolk did not gather to discuss it. They only passed it in silence, eyes glancing away as though prolonged attention might summon something from the shadows. Some claimed the plaque felt warm to the touch at certain hours of the night, though none stayed long enough to be certain. The state, eager to assure the public that oversight had improved, issued quiet directives to every parish in the county. Clergy rotations would be more frequent, finances would be monitored, and no one person could retain sole authority over a choir for more than a single season. On paper, it looked like progress. In practice, it was only another layer of administration, another file in another cabinet. And the church in Fair Hollow, already a ruin, remained outside their concern. No official body came to dismantle it. No crew came to clear the font or remove the bell's empty frame. The state regarded the place as dead. But death in Fair Hollow had never meant absence. Those who lived nearest to the ruins swore they heard it first, though they did not rush to tell anyone. On certain nights when the wind dropped and the moon was sharp enough to cut through the dark, a sound would rise from the direction of the old church. It was not the fractured moan of wind through stone nor the restless creak of trees. It was a harmony, soft, deliberate, impossibly precise. The notes wove together in a way that human voices rarely managed in life, as though each tone had been shaped by a single patient hand. It carried across the fields, over the hedgerows, and into the narrow lanes, dissolving only when it reached the first row of houses. Those awake to hear it never spoke of it the next day, perhaps fearing that putting it into words might make it return in the wrong way or make it come closer. Children, of course, were less careful. They would whisper of voices that did not sound like voices, of music that seemed to hum through their bones rather than their ears. Some claimed they could make out words, not in any language they knew, but still clear in meaning. One boy said the sound made him think of light being drawn into a jar. Another said it was like water filling a throat. The adults hushed them, but their own faces betrayed unease, for in the depth of those harmonies was a shape, a structure too exact to be born from chance. It was the shape of a hymn, but not one that had ever been taught in the town's small school or sung in its parish before the fire. And so Fair Hollow carried on, its fields tilled, its markets open, its children raised beneath the shadow of something they had agreed never to name. The ruin stood as it always had, its dark stones holding the weight of countless storms, its empty windows catching the pale light of dawn. At night, when the air was still enough to carry sound without distortion, the harmony would sometimes return, pure, cold, and perfect, as though conducted by a hand that had never ceased its work. Those who heard it knew better than to follow it, for the voice of the living can be ignored. But the call of the dead has a way of being answered whether one wills it or not.